The roar of the flames cut through the silence of the crowd. The acrid smell of burning would mix with the cold morning breeze as a young woman stood in the center of the square, chained to a stake. Her gaze, firm and determined, showed no fear. The fire spiraled upward around her, consuming the simple garments that had once been the armor of a warrior. The cries of the crowd blended with the prayers of the few who still believed in her. In that moment, Joan of Arc was not just a young woman condemned to the flames. She was a symbol, an echo of something greater than herself. How did a peasant girl, with no military training, no noble lineage or influence, manage to lead armies and change the course of a century-old war? How did her unwavering faith transform her from a simple girl into a legend that would echo through the ages? To understand, we must go back to the beginning. Rouen, May 30th, 1431. Thick smoke rose in spirals, carrying the scent of burning flesh. The crowd watched in silence, some with horror, others with relief. For the English, this was the end of a threat. For the French who still followed her, it was the death of a saint. But for Joan, it was merely the fulfillment of a destiny. She had defied kings and commanders, changed the course of France, and won impossible victories. But now, here, in this moment, everything was reduced to the ashes carried away by the wind. Her name would be stained by the accusation of heresy, her mission ended by fire. But something in her expression suggested that she knew. This story was not ending here. Her legacy was only beginning. The year was 1412. France was fragmented, devastated by a war that had lasted for decades. The rightful king, Charles VI, did not truly rule. His mind had deteriorated, leaving the kingdom at the mercy of ambitious nobles and foreign armies. In the north, the English solidified their hold with the support of the Burgundians, while in the south, those loyal to Charles of Valois fought to keep the hope of a unified France alive. Paris, once the heart of the kingdom, was under enemy control. Reims, where French kings were traditionally crowned, was also out of reach. Without a legitimate coronation, Charles VII was merely a dauphin without a crown, a prince without power. The fate of France seemed sealed. Slowly, the kingdom was being swallowed by the English. But amidst the chaos, in a small village in the northeast, a girl was born who would change everything. Domremy was an insignificant village, surrounded by fields and forests. It was there, far from the great cities and palace intrigues, that Joan of Arc was born. The daughter of humble peasants, she grew up without luxury or privilege. Like most girls her age, she helped with household chores and worked in the fields, never imagining that one day she would trade the simple wool of her garments for the armor of war. But Joan was no ordinary girl. From childhood, her faith set her apart. She spent hours in prayer, seeking refuge in the village church. At the age of 13, everything changed. She began to hear voices. At first, they were soft whispers, a mere sensation of presence. Then they became clear and unmistakable. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret appeared to her, bringing a message. Her mission was to save France and lead Charles VII to the throne. Joan's childhood was marked by hard work and devotion to her faith. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a respected peasant in the community, while her mother, Isabelle Romee, ensured that her daughter was raised within the precepts of the church. Though Joan never learned to read or write, her memory was sharp, and her prayers were constant. Domremy was located in the Champagne region, where the scars of war were visible. English and Burgundian troops frequently passed through the village, looting and destroying crops. Misery and fear were part of daily life. Even so, Joan felt that there was something more for her. Her faith was absolute, and her heart burned with a purpose she did not yet fully understand. When the voices began to speak, she hesitated at first. Was it imagination? A divine test? But the messages were clear. France needed her. The Dauphin needed her. God had chosen her to free her people. Slowly, doubt gave way to conviction. At 16, Joan decided she could no longer ignore the call. She would leave Domremy and find the King of France. The visions became more frequent. Saint Michael, in his imposing golden armor, reminded her of the importance of courage. Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret gave her advice on patience and determination. They assured her that God was on her side and that she had to act quickly, for the situation in France worsened by the day. Joan tried to tell some people about her visions, but she was met with disbelief. Even the priest of Domremy listened with skepticism. How could a simple peasant girl be sent by God to save France? But Joan was undeterred. Her voices had been clear. She needed to find the Dauphin and convince him of her mission. The first obstacle arose in her own home. Her father, a strict man, was furious when he discovered his daughter wanted to leave. He threatened to marry her off by force to prevent her from traveling. But Joan did not yield. With the help of an uncle, she escaped from home and traveled to Vaucouleurs, where she sought the help of the local commander, Robert de Baudricourt. It was the first of many battles she would face, but for her, destiny was already sealed. Vaucouleurs was neither a great castle nor a center of power, but for Joan, it was the gateway to her destiny. The local commander, Robert de Baudricourt, was a skeptical and pragmatic man. When the young peasant girl appeared before him, claiming she had a divine mission, he laughed. To him, it was unthinkable that a girl with no military training could change the course of the war. But Joan was not intimidated. She insisted, declaring that it was only a matter of time before the English conquered all of France if Charles VII did not take his crown. She prophesied that a great defeat was approaching. Baudricourt ignored her warning and sent her back home. With no alternatives, Joan waited. When rumors of a major French defeat on the battlefield reached the town, Baudricourt began to reconsider. How could this peasant girl have predicted what would happen? The commander, still reluctant, finally relented. In February 1429, he provided Joan with a small escort and ordered them to travel to Chinon. To ensure her safety, Joan dressed in men's clothing, a decision that would later be used against her. The journey to Chinon was long and dangerous. For 11 days, Joan and her escorts rode under the constant risk of enemy ambushes. The English and Burgundians controlled much of the territory, and any sign of a figure traveling to meet Charles VII could mean death. When she finally arrived at court, Joan was not received immediately. The Dauphin hesitated. His position was fragile, and trusting a young peasant girl could be seen as a sign of weakness. Moreover, many doubted her sanity. Was she a prophetess or an impostor? To test her, Charles VII devised a trick. He hid among his courtiers and placed another man dressed in royal robes in his place. Joan entered the hall, looked around, and walked directly to the true Dauphin, kneeling before him. She knew who he was without ever having seen him before. The court was stunned. How could a peasant girl recognize the king without ever meeting him? Charles, intrigued, ordered Joan to undergo religious interrogations. If her mission was truly divine, she would have to prove it. But Joan did not hesitate, because she knew she was fulfilling what God had commanded. France was on the brink of collapse. Orleans, the last great stronghold south of the Loire River, had been besieged by the English for months. If it fell, nothing would stop the enemy's advance. Charles VII knew he had to act, but his generals were demoralized. It was then that Joan, after passing the religious interrogations, was finally granted permission to march to war. Dressed in white armor and carrying a banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary, Joan set out for Orleans in April 1429. Her arrival had an unexpected effect. The soldiers, once disheartened, found a new reason to fight. Even the most skeptical veterans saw something different in her. Joan was not just a spiritual leader, she was a warrior. The coronation of Charles VII in Reims marked the peak of Joan's journey. Her mission seemed fulfilled, but for her, there was still more to do. The war was not over, and the English still controlled Paris. Determined to liberate the capital, Joan insisted that the king continue the offensive. However, Charles, now crowned and more concerned with diplomacy, began to hesitate. The king's advisors saw Joan as a risk. Her popularity was growing among the soldiers and the people, but at court, she was becoming a nuisance. Many nobles and clerics questioned her influence and feared that she was becoming more powerful than the monarch himself. Even without Charles's full support, Joan marched with her men to Paris. On September 8, 1429, she led a direct assault on the city's walls. The battle was brutal, and Joan was wounded by an arrow in the leg. Despite her efforts, the attack failed. The next day, the king ordered a retreat. For the first time, Joan faced defeat. And worse, she realized she could no longer count on Charles VII. Joan's influence at court began to decline rapidly after the defeat in Paris. Charles VII, now more secure on the throne, prioritized political negotiations over total war. Joan, impatient and determined, continued to fight, refusing to accept a truce with the Burgundians. In early 1430, she set out for the city of Compiègne, which was under siege by the Burgundians. When she arrived, it was already too late. The enemy had taken position around the city. On May 23, while leading an attack against the Burgundians, she was surrounded and captured. Her men tried to rescue her, but the city gates closed before she could retreat. Now a prisoner, Joan expected Charles VII to send a rescue, but he did nothing. The young warrior who had secured his coronation was abandoned. 6 months later, she was sold to the English for £10,000. To her enemies, she was not just a prisoner, she was a threat, and threats had to be eliminated. Joan was taken to Rouen, the heart of English rule in France. There, she would face a trial conducted not by warriors, but by clerics loyal to England. The goal was not to seek the truth but to discredit her image and justify her execution. Her main accuser was Pierre Cauchon, a Burgundian bishop determined to prove that Joan was a heretic. For months, she endured exhausting interrogations, pressured to confess that her visions were false and that she had defied the church. But Joan stood firm. Despite the brutality of her conditions, chained and constantly watched by male guards, her intelligence baffled her inquisitors. When they tried to trap her with theological questions, she answered wisely. But the verdict had been decided long before the trial began. When she finally relented and signed a forced confession, retracting her claims about divine voices, Joan was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, upon returning to her cell, she resumed wearing male clothing, a violation her judges used as the final justification for condemning her to death. Joan's fate was sealed. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan was led to the Old Market Square in Rouen. The sky was overcast, and a silent crowd gathered to witness the execution of the young warrior. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a friendly face, but there was no one to save her. Chained to the stake, Joan asked for a cross. An English soldier, struck by sudden remorse, improvised a cross from 2 pieces of wood and handed it to her. With tears in her eyes, she clutched the symbol to her chest and murmured her final prayers. When the fire was lit, the flames rose quickly. Smoke obscured her figure, and her screams echoed through the square before being drowned out by the roar of the fire. Some in the crowd wept, others cheered, but no one forgot what they had witnessed. The English hoped her death would end her influence, but they were wrong. Joan of Arc's ashes scattered in the wind, but her legend had only just begun. Joan of Arc's death did not bring the peace the English had hoped for. On the contrary, her execution only strengthened her legacy. The young peasant girl who became a warrior had become a symbol of French resistance. The troops that once fought without motivation now had a martyr to inspire them. 25 years later, in 1456, Charles VII ordered a review of the trial. The king who once abandoned her now recognized her importance to France. The court re-examined the evidence, heard witnesses, and concluded that Joan had been the victim of a political trial. Her conviction was overturned. Centuries passed, but Joan was never forgotten. Her story continued to inspire generations. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. Today, she is one of France's most revered figures, remembered not just as a warrior but as a symbol of courage, faith, and determination. Her enemies tried to erase her name with fire, but in the end, it was the fire of her conviction that set history ablaze. Joan of Arc was not just a girl, a soldier, or a saint. She was, and always will be, the legend that changed France forever. If you enjoyed this incredible story of courage and faith, don't forget to leave a like so more people can discover the legend of Joan of Arc. And if you want more epic stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any content. Here at Sagas of History, legends never die. They are told.